So we were talking last time about the evolution of the civil rights movement and how when W.E.B. Du Bois is one of the founders of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, he sets in motion a civil rights movement that profoundly shapes the lives not just of African Americans, but white Americans, and really changes the racial politics of the whole 20th century. His work has a big impact for decades. And I mentioned a number of legal victories the NAACP was able to achieve in this time period. And also, the other civil rights cases that sometimes didn't directly involve the NAACP, but nevertheless were given aid through the success of that movement. And we've gotten to a case, I want to go into a little bit more detail, Sweat versus Painter. This is the case that desegregates the law school at the University of Texas in Austin. And this really does open the doors for later decisions, including a much more famous decision, Brown versus the Board of Education. So, real quickly, Heman Sweat was a postal carrier from Houston. He was also a political activist. He had campaigned for civil rights in Texas. He wrote columns for a black-owned newspaper chain. I mentioned the Dallas Observer before. That was a newspaper that was really pro-civil rights, although they carried advertising for skin bleach. We talked about that last time. Well, Sweat wrote for that publisher. His name is Carter Wesley, who is a major force in civil rights in Texas. And Sweat applies to the law school at UT Austin. And he's denied admission specifically because he's African American. Now, when he files a lawsuit, the Texas legislature is worried about the future of segregation in the law school at UT. They offer him the opportunity, quote unquote, to study law in a separate building several blocks away where he would sit in the office space. Law professors would come over there to teach him individually. They would bring law books. He would have no interaction in class with other students. And he wouldn't be able to use the UT library directly. And this was going to be the alternative. And sensing that that might not hold up legally as equal. Remember the decision in the 1890s, the famous court decision that said that segregation is constitutional as long as it's equal. There's no way you're going to be able to argue that in court in the late 1940s that is going to be equal facilities for African Americans. Now, that's the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. So, the state legislature then begins to find a new dodge. To avoid integration, they'll create a law school. And that's the origin of what becomes Texas Southern University. That is open as the Black Law School. That was the intent of the legislature so they could avoid integrating the UT Law School. Heman Sweat's going to prevail in his case. And that's going to be, a 1949 decision. He enrolls in UT Austin, and it proves to be a really miserable experience. Some professors, some students are supportive of him. Others make his life hell. At one point, Heman Sweat is in the library, and when he comes out, there's a giant cross burning on the campus, right by the library, and, that's a symbol of the Klan, and his tires are slashed. Here he is right here, by the way, registering. He's standing in line for registration at UT Austin, and waiting for his turn to sign up for the law classes. His experience at UT is rather miserable. He gets sick from high blood pressure. He has to reduce his class load. He doesn't pass some courses because of all the emotional pressure. And eventually he drops out. But nevertheless, a precedent is established that UT cannot segregate its law schools. And I said last time that the strategy of the University of Texas to deal with segregation was to try at the highest levels of education first. Try for postgraduate level, which law school is, graduate school programs, PhD programs. Work your way down to undergraduate programs, then to the high schools, and eventually work your way to the elementary schools, because there is such an intense emotional reaction white racists have to the ideas of black and white children playing together. And so they're aware of that, and they're trying to deal with that and just establish precedent with older people who are adults. Now, the Sweat versus Painter case is one of many foundations for one of the most important Supreme Court decisions ever, Brown versus the Board of Education. This case will overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. This will mark a repudiation of that decision. And it's remarkable who is the judge who manages to get a unanimous decision on this case. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court had just recently been appointed. He's Earl Warren. He was a former Republican governor of California who had been appointed by Dwight Eisenhower, and he will end up being the Chief Justice who presides over the most liberal Supreme Court in the history of the United States. Eisenhower will later say that appointing Warren to the court was the biggest damn fool mistake he ever made in his career. But it was a very good thing for African Americans, for prisoners who are being abused in the prison system, for women, for a large number of people benefited from the Warren court. And one of the decisions very early in his career as the Chief Justice is the Brown decision. And one of the things that Warren was really gifted at was getting the court to agree, to reach consensus, particularly on really important issues that would change previous precedent. I just want to point out that we see Ms. Brown, Linda Brown, is a young girl. She's at a segregated Kansas schoolroom. And what that illustrates, by the way, is that segregation was not confined to southern states. Kansas is not a southern state. There she is right there. That's Linda Brown, whose name is going to be on this very important decision. And here's what the court says in that decision. They're challenging school segregation. A number of other school desegregation cases are attached to Brown's lawsuit against the Topeka, Kansas school system. And the court says this, and this is a sweeping decision. It says that school segregation period, all segregation is inherently unequal. Essentially, the court's reasoning is this: if you designate that a group of people are unworthy to be with another group of people, that's premised on a notion of inequality. And the society is going to be closed to you if you're regarded as a pariah in that way. And they say the language of the 14th Amendment, which provides equal protection under the laws, is very clear. And so they said school segregation is now unconstitutional. Segregation itself is unconstitutional. So this will obviously have a big impact way beyond schools, because on the basis of this, you're going to begin to see laws overturned that provide separate seating in buses, separate seating in theaters, separate dining facilities, and so on. This begins to unravel legal Jim Crow, what I call de jure segregation, segregation by law. However, de facto segregation will continue, and in fact, southern states continue to drag their feet in implementing, and desegregation will be a struggle that continues to this very day. Whites will find ways to evade the law. Laws will remain on the books until they're specifically challenged. And part of the problem is, a year later, there's another decision that's a sequel to the Brown decision, and it has to do with implementation. How much time do the school districts have to dismantle segregation That case is known generally as Brown 2. And what they say is this. They say that school districts must act with all deliberate speed. That's the language they use. All deliberate speed. What does deliberate mean? Deliberate means, in one sense of the word, very carefully, which opens the door to a legal interpretation that school districts can take a very, very long time to implement decisions. So, for instance, Dallas will lose a school desegregation case, 1961, TASB versus Estes. That case takes, by the way, 4 decades to finally resolve itself. The origin, when Dallas, actually before the TASB case is filed, there's a court decision that orders Dallas schools to desegregate. That's going to be in the early 60s and before the TASB case. And in that decision, the judge upholds a plan initially where Dallas is saying it's going to integrate 1 grade at a time, which means that it would take 12 years to implement. And so this is going to be, these southern states are going to find any way they can to resist, to evade, etc. And by the way, this really does cause a massive problem in terms of implementation of Brown. There's so much hostility, so much anger. One of the ugliest Supreme Court, or one of the ugliest attempts to integrate schools in the South is New Orleans. This little girl is Ruby Bridges. She had to be surrounded basically by armed guards. We see this kind of ugliness all the time where even little children are threatened. And one can only imagine the confusion and fear this small child is facing as she's surrounded by marshals who are there to protect her life because she is trying to go to school. The burden for integration always fell upon African American children. They were sent to white schools. White kids weren't sent to previously all black schools in this era. And the experience was often really ugly, as you can guess just from this picture here, and that brave child. This is the reaction to Little Rock integration, the attempt to integrate Little Rock High School. And note, and we're going to talk about the Cold War in a second, they refer to race mixing. Remember I talked about miscegenation, sexual intercourse between whites and blacks, having interracial children, interracial marriage, how at the point this picture is taken in Little Rock in the late 1950s, that is still illegal across the country. There are anti-miscegenation laws in states all across the union. Note that they see this as not only a communist conspiracy, but you can't see this here. He says it's the work of the Antichrist. That's what the sign says behind there. It's the work of the devil, that God supposedly meant white and black people to be separate. Now, there is going to be one way to evade the Brown decision, is what's called massive resistance. Where states will take extreme measures to avoid complying with the Brown decision. So there's a governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus. And what he does is, to evade complying with Brown, he shuts down all the public schools. He just shuts them down. You can't integrate a school that's not open. White kids and black kids aren't going to be going to school. And in fact, a lot of states like Virginia, this happens, in Arkansas, etc., set up what are called segregation academies. Where these are private schools opened by, very often, churches, religious leaders, like someone who's going to become very famous later, a Christian right leader named Jerry Falwell in Virginia will open up a private academy, and it's a private group. At that point, they get away with admitting whoever they want to, which means they admit only white students. So, and they get state money to go to these schools, even though they're church schools. That's a common thing. By the way, at Little Rock, Arkansas, the students who ended up going to that high school, the African American students, got beaten, they got kicked, they got pushed down. One girl had acid squirted in her face during these efforts. It took a tremendous amount of courage to be a pioneer African American student in these institutions and to fight for freedom in that way. Now, this brings up another point I want to make about this era, that the politics of civil rights are going to change partly because of what's happening in the world. So the NAACP advances the civil rights cause through these legal cases. Law by law gets knocked down as unconstitutional because of the NAACP's work. However, there are going to be other civil rights movements that take a different approach, and I want to talk about particularly direct action. As with every single war in American history, millions of African Americans are going to fight in World War II. Although the military itself is going to be segregated until the order from the Truman administration during the Korean War, and even then it takes a long time to implement that decision. Truman orders a desegregation of the military during the Korean War in 1950 to 1953. It's going to be some time. Up until Truman's order, there had not been a single African American in the Marine Corps. They were basically prohibited. The Air Force is created after World War II. The Army Air Force had always been, excluded. Then we have some Tuskegee Airmen during World War II, but the Air Force initially is an all-white force. So there's a real resistance in the military to integration. Nevertheless, African Americans serve. They fight with distinction, as they do every war. And a lot of civil rights leaders talk about double V, meaning double victory. What does that mean? They're saying they want to fight a victory, or they want to achieve victory against Hitler in Europe, and they see the Nazis as the ultimate embodiment of white supremacist thinking. They beat racism in Europe, and then they want to beat racism at home. If they're going to defeat Nazism, which was a regime dedicated to slaughtering those they saw as non-Aryan, non-whites, they want to also defeat the people who are segregating bathrooms and schoolhouses and businesses. So many of the activists in the civil rights era are going to be African Americans. And their extended families, a lot of them are going to be college students. Remember that Du Bois talked about the talented 10th? Students going to historically black colleges and universities are going to be a major force in the civil rights movement after the World War II. And so that's important. Here's something else. After World War II, there are two superpowers. Two countries come out of that war much more powerful on the international stage than they were before they got into the war. Much more dominant. It's going to be the United States and the Soviet Union. Great Britain had been a dominant power really until World War I, It's still seen as one of the major world powers, but the combination of the two world wars really put England in decline as a world power. The United States eclipses England as a world power, and the Soviet Union, which played really, to be honest, the most important role in defeating Nazi Germany in the World War, are both superpowers, and they're competing for the allegiance of all these nations that are becoming independent across the world. When England and France are defeated, or France is defeated by the Nazis early in the war, and they try to regain control of their empire, those peoples are impatient with being a colony. French have colonies in France, they have colonies in Southeast Asia. These nations become independent. The British can no longer maintain the empire they had. Their major colonies, such as India, the colonies they had in Africa, become independent. These are nations occupied by people of color. And the United States is trying to persuade these newly independent nations that the U.S. is on their side and that American-style elections, American-style capitalism is the way for them to follow, and they should back the U.S. in its Cold War, its conflict with the Soviet Union. The communists are able to point to the ugliness of segregation in America, and they have a tool on their side unintentionally. One thing that happens that becomes commonplace in American homes in the late 1940s, much more common in the 50s and the 60s, are televisions. And in the United States, those television networks covered the news. And actually, those images out of the South in the conflict over civil rights actually provided the Soviet Union an argument. Because you saw African Americans simply trying to get served at a lunch counter, getting beaten up by mobs, white mobs. The newspaper photographers would take photographs, TV camera would film, while black students dressed in suits and ties very often were sitting on the lunch counter, getting pulled down, getting ketchup and mustard poured in their hair, getting flour poured on them, getting kicked. They'd be outside in the streets trying to integrate a business, and police would release vicious dogs to attack them. They'd be hit by water from fire hoses going at high velocity, and the water would tear skin off their bodies, and they'd be knocked down, sometimes little children. And this actually became images shown all over the world. And the United States is trying to present itself as the embodiment of freedom, while they're abusing their own citizens and denying them basic rights, including, by the way, the right to vote. How democratic is a country when one population is systemically being denied the right to vote by those voting restriction laws like the poll tax and the literacy test? It made Americans look like hypocrites. And one of the more important things that happened is a series of Democratic Party administrations becomes really aware of the issue, that this is hurting them in what they call basically a battle for hearts and minds. That they want to win the affection and the allegiance of people around the world in their struggle against the Soviet Union. They're trying to prevent the spread of communism. And the segregation issue makes that more difficult. By the way, something else happens. We mentioned 1915 to 1930. There had been a migration of African Americans from the South to the North, and by the millions. And African Americans are able to vote in the North to a degree they can't vote in the South. They are an important voting bloc. They had traditionally been loyal Republican voters. However, starting in the 1930s under Franklin Roosevelt, there began to be New Deal programs that sometimes directly benefited African Americans. Franklin Roosevelt, a Democrat, his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was a very vocal and visible supporter of civil rights. There was a key moment. Eleanor Roosevelt in late 1930s, she was a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, a group that you can only belong to if you're a woman whose ancestor fought in the Revolutionary War. The DAR had agreed to allow Marian Anderson, who was an opera singer, to perform at one of their venues that they owned, one of the buildings they owned. And when they found out she was black, they wouldn't let her sing. And Eleanor Roosevelt quits that organization in outrage. And she arranges for Marian Anderson to perform at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. The Roosevelt administration is seen as standing behind that woman, and it's broadcast on radio networks all across the country. These kind of gestures really began to get Northern African Americans to switch their allegiance from the party of Lincoln to the party of the Roosevelts. And then in 1953, of course, I just mentioned Harry Truman, Roosevelt's successor, a Democrat, signs the order desegregating the military. And then, starting in the early 1960s, the Kennedy administration, however timidly, began supporting the civil rights movement. In fact, John Kennedy is pushing through civil rights legislation in the last months of his life because of, in part, the pressure internationally, this competition with the Soviet Union. It really makes a major difference. And one of the things that keeps Kennedy on his toes, Truman on his toes, etc., are the protests. African Americans began to basically embrace direct action, which means essentially, rather than filing a lawsuit as your first and major course of action, you challenge the laws directly by violating them. So therefore, students conduct sit-ins at lunch counters. Whites and black students go to sit in at lunch counters in North Carolina. It's a whites only counter. They sit there, they wait to be served. Or you have white and black people together sitting in the whites only seats, sitting next to each other, violating the laws regulating where you can sit in a bus. They go and they boycott businesses. And this becomes a national movement where African Americans tell people, you know, Woolworths, the department store, drugstore chain, they have stores in the north. In the south, they're not letting African Americans shop there, get a lunch there, use the bathroom. Well, guess what? We're going to not shop there at all. We're not going to go to Woolworths. And there are protests outside of Woolworths. Former Miss America at one point participates in one of the demonstrations. And so this is really going to be seized by a group in the 1950s, led by Martin Luther King Jr., called the Southern Christian Leadership Council. They're going to embrace boycotts and direct action. A famous example of this is in Montgomery, a boycott of the buses. They will basically not use the city bus system because it's segregated. They have segregated seating. You have, just the entire African American community participating in that, even though it's a horrible inconvenience. You have ride sharing, basically. African Americans agree to drive maids to their jobs that they have. The city tries to crack down and arrest African Americans who are riding groups in cars. But eventually, the economic impact is really severe. They learn how to use economic pressure, consumer pressure. And this really changes the dynamic and creates the momentum for legislation that's eventually passed. 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which I must note, are passed in the administration of a Texan, Lyndon Johnson, who was John Kennedy's vice president. He became president in 1963 after Kennedy was murdered in Dallas. Early in his career, he'd been a segregationist, but to his credit, when he becomes president, he makes his priority passing the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And in fact, the law he passed was much more sweeping than anything Kennedy proposed. And what really is revolutionary is the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which really changes national politics forever. African Americans now are going to vote in large numbers in the South, to the extent that old line segregationists are going to have problems within their own party. And some of them soften, many of them, because African Americans know the Democratic Party is the powerful party at that time, they vote in Democratic primaries. Some of those Democrats become Republicans, and you see a switch in the identity of the parties in terms of racial issues. So we'll leave it at that. Next time we're going to talk about a very difficult topic, and I'll give you a warning that some of the material we'll cover will be disturbing. We'll discuss lynching in America from the 1880s until it begins to diminish sharply in the 1930s. Thank you.